Okay, good evening, folks. We are just going to begin in a couple minutes here. Thank you very much for your patience. It's good to see everyone here. And to all of you online, thank you for being here with us. And our host will join us just shortly. Thank you so much. Hello. Hello. Welcome. There you are. Good to see everyone. My name is Brad Levine. I'm the Vice President of the Douglas Coldwell Layton Foundation for Social Democracy, and it is my pleasure to be your MC for today's inaugural Dave Barrett Lecture. It's very exciting. I'm reminded of a story being from the foundation. Tommy Douglas started the foundation after he stepped down as leader of the New Democratic Party of Canada in 1971, when Andrew Petter was middle-aged. I had to. I'm sorry, I had to. I worked for him, so it's okay. Tommy Douglas saw after he served as Premier of the province of Saskatchewan for 18 years. But what I like to tell my friends, especially from Saskatchewan, where my father was born, so I've got roots in the province, but I'm born and raised in British Columbia. I always like to remind friends that we in British Columbia have as much stake, claim to Tommy Douglas as the people of Saskatchewan. He served as a member of Parliament for 17 years. And of course, he served as Premier of Saskatchewan for roughly the same time. So he spent equal parts as Premier as he did Member of Parliament for Coquitlam, Burnaby, and then later Nanaimo and the Islands. And I'm reminded of a story after the doctor strike in 1961 and 62, after the final phase of Medicare was being introduced in Saskatchewan, where the party ran and won on a mandate to complete Medicare. The doctors, funded by American interests and the American Medical Association, saw that if Medicare was to gain roots in the province of Saskatchewan, it would likely be spread throughout the country. And so they knew that they had to stop it in Saskatchewan or it would become right across this country. And Tommy lost his bid in the seat of Regina City in the 62 federal election campaign. After that, Member of Parliament stood down in Burnaby, Coquitlam, and Tommy became a Member of Parliament from British Columbia. And he served there for many, many years, and then later Nanaimo and the Islands. But Tommy, being the leader of the party, very frugal man, very conscious of how precious money was, he was always making sure that he kept tabs on expenses. One of the expenses that was new to him was long-distance calls from British Columbia back to Ottawa. And one day, in the olden days, for those young folks, you had to call the operator to talk about the invoice of what your long-distance charges were. This is obviously a big difference today. And he was very upset with the charges, being a Member of Parliament from British Columbia and phoning back and forth in the constituency office and the office in Ottawa. And he gets the operator on the phone and says, "These charges are outrageous. When I was Premier of Saskatchewan, I could call into hell for cheaper." And the operator said, "Mr. Douglas, when you're calling in to hell from Saskatchewan, it's a local call." Yes, it is on. It is on. My friends, it is so wonderful to have you all here this afternoon for the inaugural Dave Barrett Lecture Series. As I mentioned, Tommy Douglas started the foundation in 1971. He insisted at the time that his long-serving colleague and friend, MJ Coldwell, would be also a founder. He was a Member of Parliament for the CCF in Saskatoon. He was the last leader of the CCF before the new party was launched in the early 1960s. In January of 2021, the foundation was working with the Layton family, and now Mayor Chow, mayor of the city of Toronto. We worked with her to ensure that the legacy of Jack Layton would continue. So we added Mr. Layton's name, Jack Layton's name, to the foundation just over a year ago. The foundation is a charitable organization. It seeks to promote the principles of social democracy through education, through bursaries, grants, the publication of books, and lecture series. And tonight's lecture is our first event of the foundation's 51-year history, first event in the province of British Columbia. It is part of a national lecture series that we've launched in this past year. We've got the Alexa McDonough Women's Lecture at Mount St. Vincent University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. We have the Jack Layton Lecture series in McGill University in Montreal, the David Lewis Lecture at the University of Toronto, the Bill Blakey Lecture at the University of Winnipeg, and tonight we are launching the Dave Barrett Lecture at the University of Victoria. Very exciting. Thank you all. We thought we would do something different. This will be an annual event, but to start us all off, we're going to have a panel in a short bit. But before we do that, we have some folks that would like to not only give land acknowledgements and blessings, but we're also going to hear from the mayor as well as from you, Vic. But to start us off, please welcome Elder Doug LaFortune and Kathy Horn for the acknowledgement and blessing.
Well, hello everyone. My name is Doug LaFortune. This is my girlfriend Kathy. Gee, it's funny. We're told to come up here and we got to get done in like this, 90 seconds or something. But somebody else kind of carried on and on and on. I don't understand how that works. Anyhow, it's very wonderful to be here, and our people. Okay, by the way, I'm Coast Salish. I'm from Sayut, which is over in Saanich, and I'm an artist, semi-retired artist now. I carved the 2 house posts in front of First People's House, and now I'm an elder in training. And the president is showing me some of the ropes here, so he's here to check me out. But when people come a long time ago, people used to come into our territory like, hundreds of years ago, maybe even thousands, and they'd ask permission to come ashore. They'd all come by canoe because there was no planes or trains back then. And they'd stand up and ask permission to come ashore. They'd announce themselves, where they're from, what their tribe was. And one spokesperson would stand up and he'd extend his hands like this, which meant, we have no weapons. Can we come ashore? And if they came in peace, like they were announcing, they'd say, yes, come on in. We'd share food, we'd share lodgings, and, celebrate with them and stuff like that. So here we are in Lequaman, Songhees, Esquimalt, and my people are Wasanich people, which, is the peninsula. There's 4 tribes there. And so they only ask one thing when you come into back then we lived in longhouses, and we'd have families in longhouses. You come in, we just ask you to leave your troubles out the front door and come in peace and share everything with us. So on that note, I'd like to welcome everybody here and thank you for allowing us here to speak. Now I think my girlfriend's going to say a prayer.
Thank you, everyone. It's so wonderful to see all the participants here tonight. I offer my blessings to each and every one of you for coming and sharing your thoughts, your hopes, your dreams for our country, our communities, our cities. And as we are here in our territories, we have many wonderful people that we know we can rely on to make wonderful decisions for us. And as you move forward with this evening, my blessings to each and every one of you to have kind words, supportive words, and support for all that has come from the past, moving us forward in to our futures, all of our futures, in a wonderful way, and communicating in a heartfelt, uplifting spirit for each and every one of us, as we all are one human being peoples here in our country of Canada. And we welcome each and every one of you. And as your dinner has come and arrived, we always want to give our blessings as you share your meal, that the people that prepared the meal prepared it with love, prepared with hope, prepared to nourish your mind, your body, and your spirit. To share these things together is very important, because that brings people together. When you share a meal, you share from the heart. So as you move forward with this evening, my blessings are to each and every one of you that have come here safely. And as you finish your night and evening and you travel home in safety. So hajka, kliko, kliko. Thank you.
To bring greetings from the City of Victoria, please welcome the Social Democratic Mayor of the City of Victoria, Marianne Alto.
Well, that's got to be the best introduction I've had lately. Thank you, Tom and Kathy, for your wonderful words. It's always so important for us to ground ourselves in the lands on which we're sitting, the lives that we live in, the waters that surround us. It's such a privilege to be here, and I know in the City of Victoria we start all of our meetings reflecting on that privilege and the generosity and grace of the nations who allow us to be here and to work with them. So again, hajka. It's wonderful for me to be able to take a moment. And yes, Brad, I did count that you had 6.5 minutes after you told each one of us we had 90 seconds. So I'm going to take a little bit more than 90 seconds. I'm not old enough to remember two of our foundation members, although I am old enough to have been child labor with John Horgan as ministerial assistant in the olden times. And we both reflect on how terrible it was to be a New Democratic government when we were 12. But I did have the honor, actually, of being the national treasurer of the NDP with Jack Layton for 6 years. And I learned so much, and was proud of the fact that in those intervening years, it was one of the few times, I think it might have been the only time, when we went from one election to the other and actually came into the second election with money in the bank, because I was a draconian, terrible treasurer who went, no, all the time. But that's something that we learned to do, and Jack learned how to do that in a way where it made sense at the time, because we were always planning for the future. And I appreciated the words of the elders thinking about how important it is for us to remember the past and learn from it, but always in the effort of trying to imagine what that better future is for everyone. So I urge you all to remember what we've all done together. I'm looking around at people I haven't seen in years, but were really formative in many decades for many people other than me. All of you together, but also to do so in remembering that our job always is to look ahead and to find every conceivable way we can make change so that the people who are here throughout the region, Indigenous and non, have better lives. So welcome tonight, enjoy the night, and thank you for coming to Victoria. Wherever you're from, I embrace you as all being Victorians.
Thank you, Mayor. And on behalf of the University of Victoria, please welcome Lois Harder, the Dean of Social Sciences.
Well, good evening, everyone, distinguished guests, colleagues, friends. It's so wonderful to have you here this evening. It is our inaugural, we hope, Dave Barrett Lecture on Innovation in Government. And I don't know that every year will be about innovation in government, but it probably should be, actually, but certainly an annual lecture. We are honored to host this panel at UVic, as we are an institution that I think embodies the values of social democracy. And it feels especially auspicious that this event falls on the day following the election of the NDP in Manitoba. Yes, with Wad Kinew as Premier. So not only is Premier Designate Kinew the first First Nations Premier of a Canadian province, he has strong connections to university governance, and he holds an undergraduate degree in economics. Go social sciences! Woo! And speaking of social sciences, I know the conversation this evening, focusing again on governance innovation, will be inspiring. We are deeply in need of fresh insights around how to ensure our collective flourishing, about processes that can help us to live together well. Through tonight's discussion and exchange of ideas, we hope to learn from our past and our present to illuminate new pathways that will energize and support future generations. As we look to our future, I would like to express my heartfelt appreciation to the Douglas Coldwell Layton Foundation for their generous support, particularly in the form of scholarships for graduate students in political science. These scholarships provide students with invaluable opportunities to further their education and make meaningful contributions to our society, continuing Dave Barrett's legacy. And I would also like to extend my gratitude to our distinguished panel and to all of you for joining us. Once again, welcome to the University of Victoria, and I look forward to an enlightening and thought-provoking evening.
Thank you for that. So let's get to our panel. But before we do so, some housekeeping. So one of the things that we wanted to ensure that we had the capabilities today is to get questions of the panel from the audience. And so we are going to ask you folks, if you have your phones with you, if you go to either the Slido, which is the app that we're using, either the Slido, www.slido.com/Barrett. You can ask your question, and you can vote questions up or down, so you can have a look at those. We ask everyone to, of course, put your ringers off, but keep your phones going. If you want to tweet or put out social media, use the social media hashtag DBL2023. So please, if you're going to tweet out either photos or commentary about tonight's panel, please use that for social media. And of course, you can see the Wi-Fi for folks that require Wi-Fi on the screens there. All right, so let's get to it. I'm going to introduce the moderator, and the moderator is going to be introducing our panel. So I'm going to ask the panelists to come and take your seats now. The moderator for tonight's panel is Jeff Meggs. Jeff is a former Director of Communications for Premier Glenn Clark. He's also an author of many books, but the one I think is most kind of crucial for tonight's conversation is his 2013 book that he wrote with Rod Mickelberg, The Art of the Impossible. It is a seminal account of the Barrett government from 1972 to 1975. He's going to be moderating our panel today. So please welcome the whole panel's coming on up, but please welcome Jeff Meggs and our distinguished panel that he'll introduce.
Well, thank you very much, Brad, and thanks everyone for coming tonight. I'm not going to dwell on the introductions very much. I suspect everybody in the room is pretty familiar with the people sitting next to me. It's a very distinguished group. I will just say briefly that we had hoped that Attorney General Niki Sharma could be with us tonight, but her calendar, as you can imagine, is pretty hectic with the House in session, so she wasn't able to join us, but we've got some great people here and in the audience, and I'm sure we'll have a terrific discussion. So first on my left, of course, is someone who got an early start, has some very interesting connections to the Barrett government, but had an illustrious career in law as a university administrator and held many cabinet portfolios. So please welcome Andrew Petter. And, next to Andrew, someone super familiar to everybody from the Victoria region, Deputy Premier Finance Minister, leader of the NDP, all-around terrific person, Carole James. And then at the far end, someone who I'm really going to struggle to control tonight. I was never able to do so in my previous job. Former Premier and great man all around, South Vancouver Island guy, lacrosse fan, and political junkie, John Horgan. So my assignment from Brad was to sort of set the table a bit about what the Barrett government achieved, and I thought I would do it in the following fashion, but first I wanted to pick up on the previous comment and say, how about Wab Canoe? That was, you know, as I watched last night, and I know very little about Manitoba, I thought it looks like he made it look easy, but all of these projects are the culmination of an enormous amount of work. You know, 2 campaigns in his case, and the enormous difficulties he faced politically, the fact that the Manitoba NDP was in some disarray, there was 2 terms of Conservative government, the work that had to go on. We can only imagine what it was, but it all came to a culmination last night, and seeing the smiles on everybody's face, you thought, okay, this is another political lesson. And certainly tonight, we're not, there'll be lots of history tonight, but we're hopeful that the focus is on the future and on action, not just on some of the war stories of the past, interesting and important as they are. So I came to BC in 1975. I grew up in Ontario, and I've been working in Alberta. I've been sort of active on the left in the university setting and so forth, maybe even the ultra left. Now that I'm retired, I can really come out of the closet that way. But anyway, I came to BC, and the Barrett government had just fallen, had just been defeated. And I picked up quite a negative vibe about the Barrett government, not just from right-wing media, who were enormously relieved at the defeat of the government, but also from a lot of people on the left and around the social democratic movement who felt that mistakes had been made, they should have gone further, there was this problem, there was another problem, and I was a bit surprised. I became one of those people, for example, who a few years later, because there were 2 subsequent elections with Dave Barrett as our leader, who was frustrated with the way Dave put distance between himself and the Solidarity movement, this huge uprising that occurred that we thought might lead to a general strike in 1983. John had a very different experience on that occasion, which I'm sure there's no way we can stop him from telling us about tonight. But I thought that it was too bad that Dave, the consummate parliamentarian, came out on the lawn of the legislature facing tens of thousands of people and said, "You came in peace, now go in peace." Hard to believe that that would be a controversial position to take at any point, but it seemed too bad at that time. But then I realized that as social credit took a bulldozer to social services, to union rights, to human rights, that it was the achievements of the Barrett government and its legislative infrastructure that they were seeking to tear down, and that Barrett's election had made it all possible. So I began to change my mind, and as I spent my life and we raised our kids here, I started realizing I was living in Barrett's BC more than I had thought. Whenever I took the C-bus, and I loved the C-bus, both our kids went to Barrett daycares, which were parent-run. There wasn't a daycare program, but they both went to daycares that had been put there by the Barrett government. My father-in-law explained to me how he became the head of the Sicamous ambulance detachment as a paramedic in a full public ambulance service when he and his guys in the Kiwanis had to go to Alberta and get an old hearse to use as a private ambulance before that. Jan and I got married in the registry office at the courthouse in downtown Vancouver, which had been transformed by that incredible Arthur Erickson building that had been put there as a result of interventions by Dave Barrett, and Arthur Erickson is the architect, and Bing Tom. Bob, I mentioned Bob Williams. And then working in the Fishermen's Union and later in the Hospital Employees Union, I began to realize daily how the changes that had been made in the labor code and the delivery of health services and workers' health and safety had made a profound impact on the lives of so many of our members, which we were counting on. And so the labor code reforms, for example, which I had been unaware of when I moved to BC, were something that became a battlefield over the next decade. So that attitude, my more positive attitude, still was not that broadly held, I have to say. And I wrestled with that over the years. So many years later, when we were beginning to think in another set of movies that we would never win an election again, we had down to 2 seats, and Carole James had shouldered the burden of our long march back to political power. My good friend Rod Mickelborough and I, he was a longtime Globe and Mail reporter, decided it was time to try to set the record straight. And so we wrote the story of the Barrett government, and we called it The Art of the Impossible. And I'll explain why in a minute. But Rod wrote what was probably the most commented on section of the entire book. It was one of those sort of fussy tasks that I thought, yeah, sure, Rod, if you want to do an appendix, by all means, go ahead. So, yeah, that's the book. It's still for sale. But he wound up with a list of 97 achievements of the Barrett government, which we put at the back. And that was something that people constantly turned to in amazement. Everything from the labor code to banning pay toilets to getting rid of the strap and so forth. And so I just want to summarize briefly before we get into the conversation some key areas that I think are the Barrett legacy, and then we'll get into the panel discussion here from our experts here. So one key theme, I think, of the Barrett government was how they overhauled BC democracy. And you have to really understand how stagnant and backward and undemocratic the province was to realize how these changes were so fundamental. Not only did they spruce up the legislature so it wasn't leaking into buckets in the hallway and so on, they brought in Hansard so that there was actually a record of proceedings. They started a question period so that questions could be asked. They funded the opposition because as opposition, they had been kept in a single room with 2 or 3 phone lines and shared desks. And so the opposition finally got, so this was the government in power, empowering the opposition and doing things like making it possible to sue the Crown and very importantly, creating a Human Rights Commission and starting a Human Rights Code. These were all fundamental changes which became, contested later, but I think are important to keep in mind. They were not always here, and they may not always be here if we're not careful. Secondly, of course, they made life better for people in very material ways, raised the minimum wage, established a minimum income for seniors, launched a pharmacare program, created legal aid, dramatically improved income assistance, created public auto insurance, and many, many more such programs. But just to name the one, I just went scooting past public auto insurance, and we had a big, big change on that front when John was Premier, and of course, David Eby led those changes. I mean, that was transformative in people's lives and was fought over tooth and nail and probably was just as critical in some respects, or should have been as critical as Medicare was in Saskatchewan. Became a big deal later, and it still is. So then the environment. They ended logging and mining in provincial parks. Think about that. What crazy radicals to stop mining and logging in parks. But that was one of the things that had to be done. Created the Islands Trust, which is really important legacy for today. I'm sure will be an argument down the road as development pressures increase. Created the Agricultural Land Reserve. Ask Doug Ford what the importance is to the public of an agricultural land reserve. They stopped the flooding of the Skagit Valley. That created Cypress Bowl in North Vancouver, and Jan was just there yesterday walking through the remaining old-growth forest there, which was protected by Dave's decisions. That was a very passionate cause of his. They transformed education, a third field I want to talk about briefly, created the community college system, a crucial innovation right across BC, banned the strap, as I said, established mandatory kindergarten, and there was much more. So I could go on for quite a while. There's 97 different points in the back of the book. I don't think it's online. I'll just stop now because I want to get to our group. But tonight we want to talk about the legacy, as I said, not just as an exercise in nostalgia, but as a call to action. It's proof that we can organize, we can campaign, we can win elections, we can make fundamental change, and that change will endure. And that's why we called the book The Art of the Impossible. The quote was from Václav Havel, the great Czech leader, who said that politics can be much more than the cynical maneuvering, intrigue, and speculation that we often see. It can be the art of the impossible, namely the art of improving ourselves and the world. So we thought that was the perfect title for the book, hence that name. So I've told you a bit about me. I'd like to just invite the panel now to tell us briefly what impact the Barrett government had on your lives. And I'll start with Andrew because I know John has a longer answer.
Well, maybe for background, I should say that I first met Dave Barrett working in a radio station in Nelson, BC. I had been working as a summer news assistant, and the news director went on the air drunk one day and got fired, for which I am forever grateful, because I got to sit in as open line show host for the summer, and it was the lead up to the 1972, I should say, the 72 election, and Dave came on the show as he came through the Kootenays campaigning. And then subsequently, I was hired as an executive assistant to the local MLA from Nelson, who became Minister of Housing, Lauren Nicholson. I was 19 at the time. Jeff mentioned the Barrett government's commitment to childcare. Some in the opposition suggested I was a manifestation of that, rather cruelly. But in terms of the impact, as I think back, I mean, the thing about Dave Barrett and the government that really has carried me my whole life, I must say, is the sense of the capacity of people to make a difference, working together in public capacity, through government, through politics. Dave was such a remarkable force because he was inspirational and practical at the same time. And he had a wonderful way of framing things that were understandable to even a 19-year-old kid from Nelson and to people in the province, and to make people realize that we have the capacity to change things for the better. And that period, that 3-year period, really was a period in which BC went from being a province that was very much around blacktop politics and resource extraction to a huge modernization with a social infrastructure, democracy, all sorts of economic initiatives and other reforms which Jeff has mentioned. And Dave had a way of explaining that and making you believe that you could be a part of that enterprise and could contribute to it. And gave me, and I think many others in this room, Dan Miller's in this room and others who worked in that government, a sense of agency, a sense that there was a real purpose that we could achieve together. And he did it with humor. Dave was wonderful at using humor to diffuse criticism. Some of you will have heard the story that Dave was accused by the Socreds in that election of being a member of the waffle wing of the NDP. And Dave's response was, "You keep calling me a waffle, I'll call you a pancake," he said to W.A.C. Bennett. In fact, I might call you a stack of pancakes. And knowing how you feel about Quebec, I'll probably call you a crepe Suzette. And he also had a way, of course, of using humor to frame the positive and to give people a sense of what government was achieving. I'd hoped we'd be able to show a clip of him today. I can't do justice to it, but I'll try a little bit. Dave loved to talk about the accomplishments of the government in ways that were humorous and understandable. And one of my favorites was when he would tell this story. I don't know if it was true or apocryphal, but he'd tell the story of someone coming up to him and saying, Dave, I love what you're doing on Mincome. I really like that pharmacare. And what you're doing with the land, that's great. But Dave, I hate this socialism. And what a simple way to simply explode the myth that socialism was a danger, that in fact illustrating the powerful and positive force that government had through the programs it was initiating, and making fun of those who tried to criticize the government on purely ideological grounds. So it was, for me, a very transformative time, but it was transformative in a way that was affirming about the power of government. And I know that things are more constrained today to some extent, but I fear that we, as a society, don't have as much faith as we could and should have in government. And I think looking to Dave Barrett and what was achieved in 3 years certainly was an inspiration to me at the time, but I think can be an inspiration to us in this time to really do more and really harness the power of government, harness the power of community to bring about social change at a time when social change continues to be needed and we have new challenges to face.
Carole. Carole, you mentioned yesterday or a couple of days ago when we talked about your encounter with community resources boards. I wonder if you'd like to explain that. A missing piece now because they did disappear.
Exactly. Thanks, Jeff, and thanks everybody for coming tonight. And I'm not going to start also giving a slam to Andrew's age, but I was 14 when the Dave Barrett government came in. And I think I want to touch on Andrew's point around formative times. Because it really was quite extraordinary. As many of you know, I grew up in a very political family. I grew up on protest lines. It was during the Vietnam War. My family was a safe house for draft dodgers. We foster kids. We were one of the first homes when Kool-Aid was starting in Victoria that took kids in before they ended up finding beds. And so politics was always a part of my life growing up. Our very first protest was no more war toys when I was 5 years old. So it started early and continued on. But what Dave Barrett's government did for me and what Dave did for me was make it real. Take it off the paper. Take it off simply a discussion about, you have to vote this way or we all need to vote this way because of these things. Because I grew up seeing those changes. My father was part of the first resource board in James Bay, in the James Bay community. And to see the difference that it made to have community directly involved, I mean, talk about active democracy. to have people directly involved in healthcare and social services and the things that mattered in the community, and to be able to be respected and be able to make the decisions that had to be made in those areas was extraordinary. And really, for me, reinforced the importance of getting out and voting, the importance of being involved in your community, the importance of being engaged in democracy in a way that I don't think I understood as well. And Dave Barrett brought that forward. He brought that opportunity forward. And, you know, that was just the resource boards were also the seed. And I often talk about seeds because I think so many seeds were planted during Dave Barrett's government. So many seeds that whether you look at, you know, all of the governments, the New Democrat governments, are even in opposition, our work in opposition, really came from those initial seeds that were planted by Dave Barrett and his government. It was interesting, I was chatting with Doug LaFortune, who brought our First Nations greeting, our Indigenous greeting today, and he was talking to me about having the strap in school. And he talked about the corporal punishment, and I'm sure like many of you, that's one of my strongest memories from elementary school was the year my principal happened to be my teacher as well in my classroom, and so the kids who got the strap came into that office to be able to get the strap. And so to again see that, you know, very controversial. I mean, you think about controversial things that we're fighting now. I had the good fortune of getting to know Eileen Daly later in her life when she moved to Victoria. And she would invite me to her long-term care home, in kind of high-end long-term care home she was in. She'd invite me for lunch twice a year because she loved the looks on the faces of people who thought she brought a communist into the long-term care home. And I think she just got a kick out of it more than anything else. I'm not sure she enjoyed the other stuff as much, but it was a great entertainment for her. But to listen to her talk about the stories and the death threats for taking away parents' rights. Again, you know, we talk about things from the past, which are coming back again, the same kinds of discussions, the same kinds of debates, done in a very different way. And just to touch on Andrew's point around Dave's way of dealing with things, today's debates and arguments are all about anger. And you look at the way Dave, I mean, nobody could give it or get it the way Dave could, but he did it with humor. He did it with love, as people talk about. He did it in a way that we don't see in the public discourse today, and that's kind of when I think about the legacy of Dave, that's one of the things that I really think a lot about. Many of you will remember, and I know we'll get into talking a little bit about the support he's provided to all of us, because I think it really was extraordinary. He gave us hope when there wasn't much hope, when we were down to 2 seats, when we didn't have a lot of opportunity. And Dave was out there on the hustings. He was out there always pulling, showing up at rallies, no matter how small, how big, how hard it was to be a New Democrat during some of those times. Dave would show up and be there. And same with advice. You know, he would phone on the dark days when he didn't have a lot of people phoning to give advice and talk about those things. When we were elected in 2005 and had almost all new MLAs, including myself as a new leader, Dave would phone and give that advice. But the one piece I want to leave you with, because it was so Dave, is Dave would very rarely say, you should do it this way. You know, this is the way I did it. He often would give his advice and say, you know, now just think about it. These are pieces that you want to think about. But there was one area that Dave would always phone, probably about every 2.5, 3 weeks when it would get up to election time. And we'd be complaining as opposition about not being able to get media and how challenging it was. And Dave would say, remember the time I got thrown out of the legislature? How come you guys haven't been thrown out yet? How come you haven't gotten on that chair? How come you haven't managed to? You'll get media, no question. And so the only thing, the last thing that I remember Dave doing is phoning and asking when someone was going to get thrown out of the house, as he was carried out in his chair when he was fighting the cuts to welfare reform, to be able to raise attention. And I think that just, you know, it exemplified the man he was. I feel very, very grateful to be able to have that history.
John, you tended to leave before you could be thrown out, but what's your Barrett reaction?
I was hoping to get thrown out, but I had to go. No, first of all, I want to say thank you to Doug and Kathy for welcoming us to the territory. I want to thank Kevin and you, Vic, for having this inaugural lecture here, to see members of the Barrett family in the front row, and so many faces that I have seen over the years coming together. This is kind of us, this is our church. We come together and we talk about the things of the past and the things that we'll be able to do in the future. That's been the essence of social democracy. It's been the essence of the League for Social Reconstruction, the CCF, the NDP, and now having a foundation that is vibrant across the country like the Douglas Coldwell Layton Foundation. That can continue to grow in university settings, in communities, wherever people gather together, an opportunity to talk about what I always used to say, that BC is filled with New Democrats. They just don't know it yet, and they need to be inspired by some of our stories, but not too many stories. And I have to say at the outset that we went from the oldest to the youngest, and so I was even younger than Carole when the Barrett government was defeated, a few years. But I did benefit unknowingly from the activities of the Barrett government. We've talked about corporal punishment. I did not know that Dave Barrett saved me from a lot of pounding, but yet he did. I worked in a little place called Ocean Falls up the coast that was bought by the NDP. I did not know at that time that it was Dave Barrett and his government that gave me a job that paid for the first couple of years of my university education. Later, when I turned an ankle and had an ambulance ride to the hospital, I did not know that it was the result of the Barrett government that allowed these things to happen. So as I began to study history and get an understanding of social democracy and the movement within starting as agrarian farmers and academics and activists, to grow into what we see today in this room, a diverse, dynamic group of British Columbians from all walks of life, that populism that Dave was able to capture, and Andrew was going to talk about this a little bit later on. He's done a bit more deep dive into this. What I want us all to reject is this notion that because we're social democrats, we can't be populist. We can't appeal to the needs of the people in our community. I reject ceding that ground of normalcy, I guess you could call it, because we have a better view of what our society could be. Utopians on some days, but practical on others. That was the essence of Dave. That's been the essence of social democracy. But oftentimes that gets lost in our vigorous internal debates. And that's also part of our strength, is that our opposition was not always those on the right. It was also those on the left. And our party and our movement was strong enough to allow those discussions to take place. It was strong enough to incorporate the views and values of a whole bunch of people from a whole bunch of different places. And a place like British Columbia, before the internet, before four-lane highways, was difficult to get around in. But yet Dave and the NDP found a way in the 1960s and 70s to prepare for that transformative period that we're still talking about to this very day. I'm hopeful, as Andrew is, that people will talk about the Harcourt, Clark, Miller period, Dan, the best chief of staff in government at the time, Dan had. And we'll talk also about the Horgan, Eby, and those that come after us as governments that were built on the foundations that Dave started, with humor, with commitment, with a positive approach to almost every complex issue. Before I ran to become leader, I wasn't able to talk to Dave about this, although I want to get to his time as a member of Parliament, because he wasn't the only extraordinary person within the NDP that represented a southern Vancouver Island constituency in the House of Commons. So did our friend Dave, and that's where I really got to know him when I was working for Lynn Hunter, who I see 2 rows back. And I was working for Jim Manley before that, and when his constituency was split into 3, Dave Stupich ran in the north, Barrett ran in the middle, and Lynn Hunter, who was she, was running in the unwinnable seat. And I was getting ready to go and work for Dave Barrett. How exciting is that? And Jim said, you know, Dave probably doesn't need your help. You should go help Lynn Hunter. And I did that, and I think both Lynn and I are grateful for the friendship that evolved from that, and also a fantastic 5 years as a member of Parliament in Saanich. But what Dave would have said to me, according to Shirley, and I know the boys and Andrew have heard this story, and I apologize if I'm saying it again, Jeff, but I said, Shirley, what would Dave's advice be to me? And Shirley was, of course, she was looking around to make sure nobody was listening, and she said, John, he would say, keep smiling at the bastards because it'll drive them crazy. And so that's what I tried to do. When Jeff made reference to the Solidarity Rally at the legislature, 30,000 people, that was my first real protest. I protested with Carole, unbeknownst to us, the Amchitka blast in Alaska in 1971, but I was just wanting to get out of school that day. I had no real commitment to the issue. But that was my first protest. My first big protest, I'd be out of daycare, yeah. My first big protest was the Solidarity Rally at the legislature. And there were 30,000 people. They were stretching all the way down Government Street, down Wharf Street, absolutely packed. And Dave came out to address the audience. Now, Jeff's right that those that have written the story would say, well, this was an opportunity lost. But it was not for me. For me, I saw a Democrat on the stairs of the legislature saying, remember this day. Remember this day. And when we get the opportunity to vote the bastards out, that's when we will take our action. And that formed my view on politics. That formed my view on the power of government versus the power of just standing outside and yelling at the building. And that's carried me through now, coming on 40 years of my life, based on Dave Barrett, this populist, funny, engaging speaker, saying to people, go home and remember this, because the election day will come where we can throw these buggers out and bring in a new government focused on the needs of people. And that's what inspired me to join the NDP. That's what inspired me to continue to promote social democracy wherever we get the opportunity. And all of us in this room, as we leave, will remember the protests we've been at and how good it felt to have our voices added to the cry in the community for change. But we also have to remember on election day, you need to elect a government, as the people of Manitoba have just done, that will focus on not just yelling at people, not just rage farming, but actually putting in place practical programs to make people's lives better. That's what Dave Barrett did, and that's what we have all been trying to do in this room ever since those great days between 1972 and 1975.
Okay, I'd like to come back to I'd like to stay with this populism theme, but go to Carole next, and then you, Andrew, because you've thought a lot about it. But Carole, we hear a lot these days about populism being a deplorable development, that it's leading to a dumbing down of politics, that it has authoritarian tendencies. As a woman leader who has your own particular style and has worked with people who I would argue are populists and some less so, what's your take on it? What's your read of populism and how Barrett was a populist?
Well, there's no question. I think you've heard it from Andrew and you heard it from John as well, that the right has taken over populism by name and by actions. And I think many New Democrats have shied away. Many on the left have shied away from populism, believing that it's a right-leaning approach. But I think Dave is exactly the example, as I talked about, when you look at the conflict and using anger instead of using love, instead of using optimism, instead of using hope. The difference that makes is critical. Does that mean that it addresses all of the challenges? No, no, there's no question. Populism isn't the answer for everything. It's not going to address all the equity issues. It's not going to address all the challenges, because populism often leaves out those on the outside already. And so I think that's a change that we have to watch for. And it makes it important to remember the context that you're in. And I think this is something we all learned in our times in government or opposition, that you have to look at the context that you're in. You can't just take a playbook from 1972 and believe that's going to work today. But you can take the principles and the values that run through everything we do as New Democrats. And so, I think populism is a critical discussion for us to have as New Democrats, but I think we have to have it again in the context of today. We can't look back and say this is the populism that worked and so let's implement it now, or take the populism from the right and say maybe we have to learn some lessons from them. We have to put it in our context as New Democrats, and we have to put it in the context of today, remembering the equity issues, remembering the change in the world, the environmental issues that are out there, and to do it in a way that doesn't set us up as we're always right and they're always wrong. And that's the danger, I think, in populism. The caution that I'd have for people is that it can often set up, I'm better than everybody else because I know the right answer, and because you don't, you're on the outside. And often people aren't as educated in the issue, or maybe not know about the issue, or maybe come from a different background to the issue. And we need to also remember in populism that we need to take the time to engage in that discussion, to really listen to what people are saying, because otherwise I fear that populism leads to more divide, not less divide.
Andrew, sir, an upside to populism?
I wrote a piece with Jim Rakowski that's in the Globe a few months ago called In Defense of Progressive Populism, which is why I'm being touted as an authority. I'm not. But populism is not an ideology. Populism is a mode of political discourse. It's really, what populism is about challenging elites, about taking on sources of power in society that one believes are contributing to injustice in society. And it can be harnessed by authoritarians, as we are seeing it has been to a large extent recently, who use that sense that people are not being well served by elites to foment anger and hatred, or it can be used to encourage people to become more engaged, to participate in a more democratic way. And I think the real question is, how is populism being harnessed? Dave Barrett was a social democrat. You've already heard. He argued strenuously on the stage and passionately and effectively and emotively that people were not being well served by elites. Tommy Douglas did the same. They were both populists through and through. But they did it with the understanding that the solution was not to resort to authoritarian power, but rather to embrace democracy, to broaden democracy, to make society more inclusive, not less exclusive, and to do so with the goal of social justice. So if populism is informed by an understanding that the goal, in order to take on those vested power, sources of power, is to be achieved through democratic means, that the goal is informed by a vision of social justice, which is informed by a desire for greater social equality, then populism takes on a very different coloration than the kind of populism that is equated, or the kind of authoritarian populism that is equated too often with populism per se. Now, my concern is this. My concern is that if people on the left, if social democrats, if people like Dave Barrett and Tommy Douglas and those of us in the room today who believe that there are elites that are not well-serving society, there is too much income inequality, that we need to rectify some of the sources of power that are not serving society well, and we don't use populism as a mode of discourse, then we are foregoing a very important instrument to actually advance social democracy. And if we only allow social democracy to be expressed in more intellectual ways, and I guess as a former university president I can be accused of that, but if we assume that's the way, then we ourselves get targeted as being elite. And we don't connect with the very people we want to connect with, the people whose interests we want to serve. So I really think we need to rethink populism. I think we need to harness populism and redeem a progressive democratic version of populism within our movement if we are to counter authoritarian populism and expose it for what it is, which is really an attempt to try to take away power from people and create new elites which are even less accountable to society.
John, here. And I would add to what Andrew just said there, that we fail our communities if we don't engage in building coalitions. Social democrats, and again, I go back to the League for Social Reconstruction, twice in one night. That's not very often that happens. But it was building as big a coalition as you possibly could. My friend Andrew Weaver is in the crowd tonight. We built a bigger coalition in 2017 than the NDP had done to that point in time. And the result was the most positive agenda on climate action, being able to institute through Carole's leadership as finance minister, a child care program, an early education child care program across the province that will never be taken away, just like the Agricultural Land Reserve, just like all of the other policies that Dave Barrett brought forward. It's by creating a larger coalition, which is the essence of what we have always been on the left. That's how we succeed. And if we seed the ground to the loudest voice, the rage farmers, then we're doing a disservice to our neighbors. We're doing a disservice to our movement, and we're doing a disservice to all of the people who have worked so hard over decades to build the foundations of a movement that is not there just for power, but is there to achieve power to produce results for the people in your community. That's what populism is all about. It's not about the Trumpian or Polyev or any of these other right-of-center approaches to this. We cannot just let them have the ground. There's I'm going to stop because I got to look from Jeff.
We're going to, well, I'd like to do one more round here, and then we'll get out your phones and go for Slido. Is that about the right timing, Brad? So this will be a chance for you folks to pose questions, and just because you've got a great question, I may not put it to them. We'll see. I'm going to exercise a bit of authority here, but. John broke into a theme which I think we need to talk about because it was relevant to the Barrett period, and I reflected a bit about it, which is the view among the population, or especially among activists, say to take the labor movement example. Yeah, the labor code was great, but that back to work legislation stank big time, and therefore the Barrett government was anti-labor or whatever. Also, women and feminists were very pleased to see some of the work that was done on choice on abortion, but not satisfied that more could have been done that wasn't done. And those were very, very fraught arguments, in the party that were reflecting public debate and very trying for the government. So could you just talk, maybe I'll go back to you, Carole, how does a government balance those competing pressures? We've talked about populism, but what about the context that decisions have to be made in, and how does a government maintain that faith while making some headway?
Well, I think the child care example is a really good example, and maybe I'll touch on that piece because I think, I was director of child care for the government in the 90s, and so, saw the push, the drive was there to start a universal child care program in the 90s at the end of that government, to be able to put it in place, start off with before and after school care. But the context of that was still an uphill battle. There were still the discussions going on, hard to believe even in the 90s, but discussions going on about you have kids, it's your responsibility. It's not everybody's responsibility. The discussion still around, why should we fund your family? You should fund yourselves. And so I think that context made it very difficult. But what I saw with the Dave Barrett government is that those seeds were planted to keep that value going. And so despite the pressures, despite the pushes, and I think it was one of the pieces to touch on the coalition, to touch on the agreement that we have with the Greens, one of the exciting things is we were able to look at common values that really mattered to all of us, put them down on paper and say, these are the priorities we're going to fight for. And so yes, every government has challenges when it comes to dollars and spending. I often said as finance minister, there was never a day when I didn't have people come forward with proposals that were worth funding. People didn't come to talk to you about things that weren't worth funding. Almost everything was worth funding. It was very rare that you could easily say no to something. But if you remembered your values, back to the populism, but if you remembered your values, if you remembered your priorities, if you knew what you could do to ensure that you gave everyone a good shot in life, that everybody, equality versus equal, again, when you come back, some people need that extra hand up. How do we provide that? And that's our job as government to do that. Then as the context moves along, you keep it front and center. So the fight for childcare didn't end. The fight for childcare continued even in the wilderness from 2001 to 2005 as a priority, as a continued push. The messaging changed, and I think that's important to remember as well. To build that broad coalition that John talked about, we also started talking about childcare as an economic tool, as helping women get back in the workforce, as helping employers who needed to make sure that they had employees to be able to work in the workplace, and using the Quebec stats that were there that showed clearly they had the largest participation of women in the country in the workforce. And so again, building that broad coalition, continuing to put the message out. And then something I never thought I'd see in my time, the federal government actually came to the table with money for childcare because it became such an issue out there. And so to be able to then join on to that meant we could get double the bang for our buck by putting in provincial and federal money and build the program, which I think, as John has said, I'd like to see any government come in and try and take away childcare support for families now. I think it's embedded as the agricultural land reserve and as embedded as those other pieces. So I think you have to look at the issue in the context, but you have to also balance, you have to make sure that front and center, your values and the things that matter and the equity issues are there, because that'll help you move it along.
Thanks, Carole. Andrew, picking up this thread in the conversation, how does a government balance the pressures between activists who've been leading these fights and a government which has fiscal and other political constraints? Have you got any insight on Barrett's legacy there?
Well, I learned in question period that you can answer a different question than the one that's asked.
Good job, Andrew.
Touché.
Although it is,
Touché.
I think it's very much related, to tell you the truth. And
Caucus discipline is weak tonight.
I think it's important. Yeah, there you go. I think for me, it's really important to understand how policy was made in the Barrett government, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions, and that in part does answer the question, et cetera. Because there's Paul Tennant, who was a well-known political scientist back in the day, wrote that the Barrett government operated unaided in terms of policy support, and that's wrong. It's true that a government that came in with all these pent-up demands and issues did not have time to establish a central planning mechanism of the kind that Tommy Douglas had or Alan Blakeney had in Saskatchewan. But it's also true that the government didn't simply take its policy from the activists in the community. The government drew in expertise. So this was a populist government, but it wasn't a government that was hostile to expertise, hostile to people who had expert advice to give on policy. If you consider the people who came in, people like David Vickers, who came in as Deputy Attorney General, Bill Nielsen, who came in and was hired by the government out of the university to bring about huge reform in consumer legislation, Paul Weiler, who wrote the labor, helped to write the labor code. Bob Williams set up the Environment and Land Use Secretariat, headed by Alistair Crerar. Norman Bortnick was brought out to head up ICBC, working with John Mica and Robert Strachan. The Barrett government drew heavily on expertise. And as a result, the policy that it produced was not always the policy that was being sought for by groups. Jeff, you know that well in terms of the labor movement. The labor code reforms that were brought about and have endured were very much informed by the government's commitment to labor, but also very much informed by the expert advice and policy work that was done by people within government that were brought into that government. And it's simply not the case that the Barrett government was not aided. It was aided by some remarkable people who came in. Mark Ellison later on, who came in as Dave's deputy minister. In fact, one of my concerns about our governments in this province now, our social democratic governments, is we don't do enough to bring in that kind of expertise. We rely too much on what is a very capable public service, perhaps, but one that doesn't have the opportunity or the knowledge to bring in some of that new energy. I think you can do it through a central planning agency, as it was done in Saskatchewan, or you can do it as Dave did and his government did by bringing in these experts. And the other thing I want to mention that I think is misunderstood is Dave Barrett was a strong, powerful personality. There's no question. I mean, he was the leader and everyone knew it. But that didn't mean that he was a dictator, because he wasn't. The policy that was made in that government was made through ministers' offices. The Agricultural Land Reserve was Dave Stupich, although when it got into trouble, Dave formed a cabinet committee, brought in Bob Williams and some others, because Dave, in fact, Stupich was being too responsive to some of the demands for full compensation for rezoning land that would have broken the government financially. So the government, relying on expert advice again and on cabinet ministers, went in a different direction. Bill King was a huge force in terms of labor legislation. I didn't mention Michael O'Dane, when the minister I was dealing with in housing. Michael O'Dane came in and informed housing policy. And so policy within the Barrett government was distributed. Carole's already talked about the decentralist instincts of the Barrett government in terms of pushing power out into communities through community resource boards. There were also justice reform boards that David Vickers set up. There was also natural resource boards set up in the Slocan Valley by Bob Williams. So think about it, again, going back to populism. Here we have a leader who's a remarkably powerful speaker, a dominant personality, and hugely influential, who nonetheless allows his government to work as a cabinet government, who believes in the value of expertise and believes that power should not simply reside in one place but should be distributed widely. There are really important lessons there. It also helps to explain why not all groups were satisfied, coming back to your question, Jeff. But it also, I think, in my view, helps to explain why a lot of these policies have endured to this day in one form or another, or if they haven't endured, they've been built on and they have influenced the policy that does endure to this day.
John, do you want to add anything before we go to the...
Yeah, I would add to Andrew, I had the good fortune of working in the government of the Harcourt Clark years. Andrew, of course, was a cabinet minister at that time, but I got to work with Alistair Kerr. He was well advanced at that time in a thing called the Crown Corporation Secretariat, which was involved in revitalizing ICBC because it had been 16 years from the creation to the Harcourt government coming to power. And of course, the right had always wanted to do away with it, but it was too darn popular and they couldn't. And so this Crown Corporation Secretariat was populated as central planning. Again, the Harcourt, Clark, Miller period also utilized the best of those who were around them, not just at the cabinet table or in the caucus, but in communities as well. And when Carole and I and Jeff had the opportunity after 2017, and Andrew can confirm this. I put you on the spot because now you have to confirm it. But no pressure. Yeah, don't heckle. No heckling. But it's populism does not have to be about this. I know all the answers. Listen to me. It's we can bring together the best and the brightest to solve the problems of our time. What can you argue with that? When COVID hit. I watched other premiers across the country elbowing their health authorities out of the way so they could go on television and give health advice. I never go to my member of parliament for health advice. I always go to a healthcare provider. So it struck me, and this is consistent with what social democrats have done, not just in British Columbia, but I'd like to think right across the country when the opportunities present itself, Blakeney being a classic example. You bring in the best people you can find to give you the best advice possible, shaped by your values. You're not abandoning who you are or the things you want to accomplish, but you're saying, and what we did, we're still pinching ourselves some days, eh? Carole and I go, she does forced marches every day, and I get once every 2 weeks, I can get on the dance card. And we just talk about how fortunate we were in the time that we had to try and move the ball down the field a little bit. Never losing sight of all of your values that have informed us, never making you entirely satisfied as we tried to implement those policies, but doing our level best to meet that sweet spot, that perfect pitch where we were realizing our commitments during the campaign, our room full of resolutions from conventions going back to the 1930s, and also the practical context with which we find ourselves in. And that's the key, I believe, to innovative government, is to not take a playbook from decades gone by, but to be informed by how people in that moment dealt with the challenges that we're seeing repeat themselves today.
So, I'm going to go to the, just a word on timing, and Brad will... I know we're going to keep going, but we're going to keep going for a while here with your questions. We have extra time that at some point, like 20, 25 minutes down the road or something, we'll pause and then get ready for the reception so there'll be a chance to talk one-on-one with some of the people. So that's how we're going to go. And now the easy questions are over. We're going to get to some more difficult ones, specific answers to how the problems of today. So I know you folks are full of policy ideas. The first one, a lot of thumbs up to this. What are some Barrett-esque innovations we could harness to address the cost of living and the housing crises we are facing in BC? Just a simple one. Keep it short. More of a tweet than a Facebook post.
Hello, Carole.
John, do you want to start?
I think Carole's better suited to answer in this context.
Yeah. To talk about the future, the room goes quiet.
Yeah. Well, I think that we mentioned ICBC, the Crown Corporation. I mentioned the Crown Corporation Secretariat and central planning. Those were innovations that the Barrett government brought in. Andrew, the other day when we were having a pre-seminar discussion, mentioned ELUC and land use planning. We as New Democrats, Social Democrats, that's all we think about. Well, how are we going to plan this? How are we going to figure this out? But it did not exist in British Columbia until the Barrett government. And it was taken to a fine art by the core process during the Harcourt administration, where we brought together workers, environmentalists, community activists, Indigenous peoples, very importantly, Indigenous peoples whose rights and title had been acknowledged by certainly started to be acknowledged by the Barrett government, fully acknowledged by the Harcourt government, and now we have the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. This was an evolution over decades, but it started with that seed, as Carole said. So I believe that some of the challenges, whether it be on affordability, whether it be on how do we manage life in a carbon-constrained economy where climate action is imperative, not just for us who are here today, but those who will come after us. We do that by finding the best and the brightest, creating a political coalition to win the hearts and minds of our neighbors, who, as I often say, you wouldn't worry what people thought of you if you knew how seldomly they did. The room's not full, I'm saddened by that, but it's not because people don't care about these issues, it's because they're getting on with their lives. And if we want to engage with people, we have to give them a reason to be engaged. And a smile on your face and a song in your heart, that will get you every time, and that's what Dave Barrett did.
Carole, solve housing for us, please.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. Small challenges. You know, they often say the pendulum swings and it goes full circle back again. And when I think to the resources boards, when I think to the discussion of community-based decision making and going back to that kind of approach, and John talked about it, you know, going back to the approach of planning together, involving everyone in those discussions. I think you're seeing some of that in the current government. You're seeing the direction of the cut and thrust, and I don't know if the mayor's still here. Yes, she is. Mayor Alto may have some feedback on that when we go into the reception, but that push and pull between the government saying you need to do this and giving the municipalities the authority and the ability to be able to do those things with the citizens in the community, I think is how we're going to solve it. We're not going to solve it alone. We're only going to solve it if everybody's doing that work together and looking at that work together with the clear belief that we have to build more housing. You know, I'm a big supporter, as I was then, of the co-op, whether it's co-op housing, whether it's co-op. We need to invest hugely, from my perspective, in the area of co-op housing. And again, that seed started in the Barrett government. You know, we moved to community schools, we moved to decentralized healthcare, the healthcare centers, women's centers. You know, I think the pendulum is swinging back again to focusing on neighborhoods and focusing on cities and focusing on the support there. And I think that's going to be a critical piece to solving not only the challenges we're going to face in the housing area, but probably the healthcare and a few other community issues as well.
Andrew.
Well, maybe I'll take housing, since that's the minister I worked for, and to make a point that may be a little controversial. I'm thinking about, you know, about the Barrett government, and Dave was performative. I mean, Dave was the greatest performer of all. But the government in its policy was not performative. The government in its policy was substantive and collaborative. And co-op housing is an excellent example. I worry that politics on both the left and the right today is overly performative. In other words, there's a problem, so we've got to be seen to be responding to it. And some regulatory measure will be brought in that may or may not be effective, and I fear too often will not be effective, particularly if the regulatory measure is one that is not about building alliances and collaboration and building support within communities, but is being seen as overly directive and punitive. I don't think that's effective policy making, and I worry that we have a tendency across the board now, from left to right, to engage more in performative politics. I much preferred the Barrett methodology, which was a performative premier who believed in substantive collaborative politics. And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of that going on around now too, but I do worry about performative politics, and I think we need to really focus on what we're doing. We need to put more of our energy into building alliances. Co-op housing is a great example where that can happen, and less on being seen to direct people to do what we may think is the right thing.
Well, I think there's a few more questions on this. I thought, and Carole touched on it, there'd be more of a discussion, or you guys would raise more about the failure of the private sector to solve the housing crisis. And we saw that with insurance at ICBC. We saw that with the exploitation of agricultural land. And so government intervention was necessary. and I think you're pointing to that requirement today. But there's 2 or 3 other questions that really flow from the housing one, and the next one I thought I would go to, because there's a question from Eli about populism. We've had a good discussion about that in my view. So what innovations are needed in policy and government to address growing generational inequality? And I think we would all agree that inequality and that growing divide is a huge problem in society. So looking back at Barrett and thinking of the future, maybe back to you, John, any quick thoughts on how that could be tackled?
Yeah, quick thoughts on the challenges of our time.
Quick wins.
Well, again, I think the theme that we've touched upon and I think brings us together is finding common ground. If you can bring enough people together to persuade the community to put in place a group of individuals who will collaborate even further upon coming to government, then you can start to chip away at some of these challenges. On the housing front, the biggest challenge is, and of course here on Vancouver Island, they're not making any more land. We're surrounded by water. So density is the solution in our urban centers. 13 municipalities in the Capital Regional District make it extremely difficult to have a broader plan. But in 2000, 2001, and our friend David Coverley, your successor, was a champion of this, the regional growth strategy. This is quintessential social democrat. Let's all get together and plan how we're going to grow. And similarly, we can all come together and plan on how we're going to take the enormous wealth. We have never been as wealthy as we are today, but we've never seen so much abject poverty at the same time. So how do we find that balance as social democrats between, to each according to their ability, or from each according to their ability, to each according to their need? I saw someone complaining about that on Twitter as, oh my gosh, it's Marxism. Well, no, it's common sense. Like if you've got an ability and you can give it to the greater good, then that's a fantastic thing. And if, as Carole said, if people need a hand up, giving opportunity leads to a better outcome for an individual, a family, a community, but also for all of us, because we all benefit when we lift people up. One way we address inequality, a practical way, was when we brought in the tuition waiver for former kids in care. Like, there is no group of citizens in our society that have had more difficulty than those who have been bounced from home to home because of no reason of their own, or not because of anything that they have done, but because of circumstance. So why not create a circumstance where you can do something about that inequality by giving them an opportunity to lift themselves up by the great equalizer in our society, education. And that starts and ends all my discussions, because if we don't have an ability to allow all of us to realize our full potential, then we're failing everybody.
I worry about the generational divide. I have to say, I think it's one of the pieces that I do worry about in society. I worry about the lack of trust that has been built, and we could get into a whole discussion on why that is, but the lack of trust or belief in the upcoming generations that there's even anything that they could do that would make a difference. The hopelessness, the discussion you're hearing about people talking about, the climate and the giving up that people are feeling, and the struggles that they're having in being able to cope. And if we don't believe in our political systems, if we dumb down, how many times have you heard somebody say all politicians lie, all of them cheat, none of them tell you anything? Those kinds of, it's not, and I'm a recovering politician now, so I can say these things in a different kind of way than I could when I was in politics. But we need to make sure that we call that out. Because if people give up, I used to say that my kids all went to vote and all their friends went to vote because I ran for school board. And so my kids would go and vote for me, and they'd drag their friends along to go and vote for me, both because they thought I was a decent person and I would do a good job, but because they went together. And so lots of those young people in their 30s and 40s now are still voting. And I can tell you, we have great conversations about politics with my grandkids now, but I don't see that in every family. It's a very unique approach still, where those discussions occur around the table with generational approaches. So I do think it is an area that we do have to seriously pay attention to, because I fear that engaging the divide, the generational divide, is going to be very tough, because young people have lost hope in lots of ways. They've lost the ability to think that any political system can make a difference for them. And that's why populism can be so dangerous if it's only on the right, because it will appeal, because people are looking for answers and they're not feeling them. So it's a piece that I think is a very serious issue for us to address over the next while.
Andrew, do you want to weigh in on that?
You can't be a social democrat and not be concerned about rising inequality in society. And I do worry. I mean, I think as a small open economy, be it British Columbia or Canada for that matter, in a more global world, the constraints in terms of policy that are upon our leaders are greater now than they were back in the 1970s in trying to deal with these issues. And of course, inequality has been hugely exacerbated. Having said that, there's all sorts of evidence out there that shows that societies that are more unequal are societies that are less functional, societies in which people are less happy, not just poor people, but rich people too. And that should be grist for a positive populism, a populism of love. Carole, you mentioned the word love. Dave was the one person who could get up on a podium and talk about love, and it didn't sound disingenuous, it didn't sound artificial. He spoke about it because he believed it. Our love for our fellow humans, rich and poor, should be to help them to find a way to a more equal society in which we'll have greater happiness for all of us, greater sense of connectivity, a greater sense of community. That should be grist for populism. The policy instruments to get us there are all the more challenging now than they were in the past, but I say that all that means is we need to redouble our efforts. But I think populism, properly applied in democratic ways, informed by love and a commitment to social justice, is an important component of the political message that we need to take to try to drive a more equal society.
Thanks, Andrew. We have a lot of questions that are all sort of tied in terms of people's interest in them, so I'm taking different topic areas. One I don't think we should leave tonight without hitting on is this one, which is how can we innovate systems of governance to achieve the action we need on climate change? And of course, John and Andrew and Carole were party to the CASA agreement in 2017, which allowed the formation of a government that brought forward Clean BC, but we've seen every year since record-breaking fires, and as Carole says, a sense of impending futility at this battle. So very, very difficult issue, but an existential one. Maybe start at this end and go the other way this time, Andrew. Have you any ideas, any innovations on the climate change front that could be done in a governance situation?
I mean, this is an issue that was thankfully not. It should have been a front and center when I was in government back in the 90s and in the 70s more than it was. And again, the challenges are great because politics tends to divide time into 4-year intervals. And people's patience, as we've seen, for solutions that require decades is not great. And we're seeing that all over. We're seeing it in spades right now in the United States. It's scary. I guess what I would say is, though, I think I still believe a lot, and Bob Williams was a huge proponent of pushing power out into communities, localizing decision-making and harnessing power at a local level. As well as obviously setting those very strong national targets and policies and provincial targets and policies. I think this is not very helpful, perhaps, but it's not well thought out. But I think more action at the local level to mobilize locally is what it's going to take, because it just seems to me that we're really struggling right now, and it obviously is an existential issue for all of us and for our children and our grandchildren.
Carole, you were in finance, and the quarterly statement said we spent north of $700 million this year on firefighting.
Yep. I think it's an issue. I'll touch on the local piece because I think that's key as well, is local decision making. But I also think it's got to be mobilized. It builds again on that trust issue. Do young people trust the existing governments to do it? No, they don't feel it's being done fast enough. They don't feel it's being done efficiently enough. They don't trust the systems in being able to manage it. And that's why I think the local piece that you raised, Andrew, is so critical, because it needs to come from the ground up. And it also has to be done, to come back to the Barrett way of approaching things, I think we've reached a saturation point, and I understand why the environmental movement has gone this route, but we've reached a saturation point around the end is coming and there's nothing anyone can do. And you don't motivate people by disaster. You don't motivate people to get out and do something if they feel like there's nothing they can do that's going to make a difference. It's too late. And that's the big discussion that I hear from many of the environmental groups, and I understand why the message is there, because the message is accurate about the urgency of what we have to fight. But if I look at major changes, even something as small as recycling or seatbelt use, or it was done in a way that gave people the opportunity to believe that they could make a difference. And somehow we've got to be able to anchor that again. Somehow we've got to be able to find that ability when it comes to climate action. Keep the big targets, make sure that we're holding governments accountable, but also find a way for people to believe that they can make a difference too. I don't know, and this isn't a plug for CBC, but there was a great CBC show this summer. We were on a road trip with the grandson, and there was a great CBC show that just provided an hour of here are little things that you can do in your own homes, in your own house, in your own community to make a difference. And every hour they'd come up with different little ideas and approaches. And I think those kinds of differences are going to be critical to being able to address what is an enormous challenge for all of us that has to be addressed.
Well, I'll take a bit of a contrary view. Kafka said there's hope, but not for us. And I hate to throw that as a bit of a downer. Joe's going, oh, he was so good until he said that. It wasn't me, it was Kafka. But with respect to governance and how do we collectively come to address the challenges, the global challenges of our time. We are 5 million souls in British Columbia in a sea of 8 billion people. So it's hubris to the highest degree to believe that somehow the solutions to unlock these problems can be found within the borders of the Rocky Mountains and the Pacific Ocean. So let's not give up, which is, of course, the prevailing view on many young people and elderly people, for that matter, and everyone in between. Instead, how do we find creative ways to set realistic targets that are believable? And with respect to governance, we've had 3 referenda on proportional representation in this century, all of them unsuccessful, but we had proportional representation in 2017 when 60% of the people who voted got what they voted for, which was our climate plan, married with Andrew Weaver's climate plan, that put in place the strongest plan on the continent. It was governance that made that happen, and we were able to achieve that because we wrote it down. We set out the limits that we were going to try and realize, and then we set about doing it. And the electorate were not deceived by the siren song of the deniers who said, oh, well, this is just a gas tax. No, it's not a gas tax. It's a cost of consumption and the impact that consumption is having on the greater good. This is a positive initiative in the community that we will all benefit from. It's not just because you have an F950 that you need to drive from James Bay to Fairfield, but if you live in Prince George, you do. And that again comes to the elites and the populism. We have to have the conversation about climate action in rural British Columbia, in rural Alberta, in Arizona, everywhere we can. And we need to build relationships. If we can't do it multilaterally through the numerous conferences that happen where people fly in and all of the Hollywood stars fly in on their jets and they say, we've got to do something about this, we can do bilateral relationships between countries or willing participants, as we did with the Green Party in 2017. Let's find a way, Japan and British Columbia, Latvia and British Columbia, Canada and anyone else who wants to participate, how do we find those solutions? That will give people hope. That will give an opportunity to campaign, not in a partisan way, but a genuine campaign for the planet, that we're all in this together. We know that. We see it every day, increasingly over the past decade, and it's not going to get better. It's only going to get worse. So sorry, again, that's Kafka, not me, Joe. And so consequently, the governance question is coalitions, alliances, the essence of social democracy. Bring more people into the tent, we're going to find better answers, and we can do it together.
Andrew,
Well, I feel a need to cast a little bit of positivity against Kafka, and with Andrew Weaver in the room, because John, you and Andrew, one of the things you launched, which I happened to be involved in, was Innovate BC. And I chair the board of Innovate BC. And there are ways in which, in very concrete terms, we can be part of providing solutions. Your government did it around mass timber, big investment in mass timber, hydrogen strategy. BC has always been a leader in hydrogen. We have to be part of turning the economy around and showing people that there can be an economy that can meet people's needs and address the climate emergency. Now, we can't do it alone, and our answers may only be a very small piece of the pie, but there are certain areas in which we can really be leaders and in which this province can show the way to others and bring about transformation that will then, in fact, become marketable commodities that will bring wealth into our province and provide solutions elsewhere. So I cling to that hope, even though I worry about Kafka too, John.
Well, I'm going to make this there's many questions that have a similar tone to them, which I would just, I'm going to go to one, but give you some background. So it's really driven by the famous quote attributed perhaps apocryphally to Dave when he met the cabinet the first time, which was, are we here for a good time or for a long time? And the reality that the electoral cycle may be too slow, it often felt that way to me, to deal with climate change, or that the agenda was too packed with massive things like housing and inequality to provide safety to trans kids. So the question is really, how can you be bold and get reelected too? And it was summed up, I think, pretty well by Martin, who said, given the social media election cycle, how can government build the courage to implement radical interventions needed to tackle modern wicked problems? And Martin provides the example of housing, but I've given a few others. So maybe some concluding remarks on that very broad question, but one that's obviously on a lot of people's minds.
Well, it's worth remembering that the popular vote in the 1975 election went up for Dave Barrett from 1972, not a lot. The reason the government was defeated was because of the coalescence of the opposition parties. In fact, if I can tell a little story, I remember when the press came down after Bill Bennett announced that the Liberals had crossed the floor, and they gooned Dave and asked Dave what he thought about it, and Dave's answer was, I never comment on the vicious internal struggles of other parties, which was classic Dave. But Dave didn't lose support for being bold. It's true that the base didn't grow hugely, but the support that he had in '72 stayed there, and it increased somewhat. So I'm not sure that governments that are bold necessarily write themselves out. And I don't know if that story is apocryphal or not, but I sure know that in 1975, the decision to call the election when it did, maybe not well-founded, that's been debated in history, but it was made very much with a desire to win that election. And a lot of effort was put into it. Nobody said, oh, that's great, we've had our 3.5 years. If they had, we would have probably gone the full mandate. We could have gone the full 5 years. We didn't. We went just over 3, and there was a desire to do more and to continue. So I think it might have seemed that way at the front end, but a few months in, I think the government wanted to continue. I think the people who supported the government wanted to continue, but due to the peculiarities of first-past-the-post politics and a coalition that was formed to try to block the NDP, backed by the business community and others, the government was not successful. I think times have changed somewhat. I think one really good thing in this province, which this government that John led can take credit for, is eliminating corporate and union donations, which has really democratized the situation. The amount of money that was thrown at the NDP in 1975 because of progressive changes it made was a big factor, I think, in defeating it. And that factor is now not on the table. Hopefully it won't come back. So I think governments can be bold and be confident and have a good chance of getting reelected. But then I'm an optimist.
Carole, do you want to?
Well, yeah, I'll continue on that optimistic viewpoint because I think it's accurate. I think one of the keys, I guess, if I was going to put any cautions or kind of guardrails around it, is not taking everything on at once, because you have to show some successes. I believe it's really critical, and it comes back to that trust issue in the context we're in now, where people just don't trust governments in the same kind of way, don't have respect for the democratic systems in the same kind of way. I think, again, back to 2017, part of the real strength was we had a list to accomplish. We were very upfront about what we were moving ahead with. And there were some very radical, I mean, bringing in the speculation and vacancy tax was not an easy thing to do. But we were very upfront about the list we were working on and why we were working on it, and the fact that it was things that mattered to the people in this province and did come back to our values of equality, the inclusivity, making sure that everyone has an opportunity to succeed. I mean, those were key. And many of you will have, you know, as I did, get tired sometimes of hearing the language over and over and over again, but we had 3 priorities, and we continued to use those 3 priorities. And I think that's critical when you come forward with a vision. So I don't see it as being about bold versus practicality. I think you can do both. But I think you have to be very transparent. I think you have to be very upfront, and I think you have to show people that there are successes that can happen. And I think that's just what Dave did. I think he did show successes. Harder to do it in 3 years, but I think similar to our run in 2017, we were able to show that as well. So I think that transparency is perhaps where the context has changed, to need to be more upfront about the things you're taking on, but be as bold as you can be, because, you know, like John, I mean, one of the proudest pieces for me, having been in that government, was the support we put in place for children in care, and that's been built on. You know, the current government decided that they would get rid of the age category. So it wasn't only for young people. If you'd been a foster child 20 years ago, 30 years ago, you can still get free tuition for education. That's giving people the kind of opportunity that everybody should have in our society. And that's what New Democrats and a democratic social government is all about.
So I feel that by saying now that I'm a relentless optimist, no one's going to believe me, but I am, and I continue to be. And I think that Carole's quite right, that the communications, the messaging of our time in government was, we have a core group of priorities, but we had hundreds of priorities. You know, it was nuts how many things we got done, not unlike the Barrett time, but it was a different time. And we also had the coalition, as it was, with 60% of the voters. So our boldness was expected. And we did not get punished. As with Dave, our popular vote went up in 2020. We got more votes more as a percentage and as raw votes than we had ever got before. And so that, I would say, emboldened us, myself, and now David, or Premier Eby, to take the bull by the horns and to say, look, these are issues that are vexing families. Affordability. What are we going to do about it? How are we going to address these issues? And if you can continue to show and not tell, you're going to get a better outcome. We were able in our time, Carole and Jeff and I, we were able to lay out for the public what we were going to do and ask them, is this okay with you? And they said in large numbers, yes, carry on. As you were, and we did, and David and his team continues to do that to this day. And we did it with the most ethnically diverse government in the history of British Columbia. We have more women in the NDP caucus than there are members in the other caucuses, and that has also never happened before. We said, I remember going into an editorial board, and these, of course, are more irrelevant now than ever before because editorial boards really don't exist as they did in the past. But going into the Vancouver Sun, and someone said, I hear you're going to do card check. And I said, yes, I am. Woo, says the sister from the Federation of Labor. And we did. And the world didn't end because other jurisdictions have card check or an ability for workers to come together and to bargain their working conditions. This is pretty basic stuff. But because of the swings back and forth and actions like the Campbell government's actions on healthcare workers and educators immediately upon coming to government, massive cuts to social spending, those were bold moves, and there was no consequence to those bold moves until we were able to win in 2017. And when we reversed it all, there was hallelujahs from those who were affected and indifference from those who were, quite frankly, indifferent to it because they didn't think it affected their lives, even though their kids were going to get a better education. If they went to a healthcare facility, they were going to get proper care in a clean facility by people who cared about them, not just because they had their contract to be renewed in a week and a half, but because they had stability in their own lives so they could provide stability to their neighbors and their fellow community members. That is the exciting part about social democracy. That's the exciting part about being bold, is at the end of the day, it's really not that bold. Because people go, well, why wouldn't you do that? That makes sense to me. You're going to reduce the amount of carbon we put into the atmosphere? That's a good idea. Carry on. And then they get on about their lives. For me, I go back to people are just trying to get by. All of them, all of you. And if we can come together regularly and not be influenced by money, by instead of saying to the National CUPE Union, give me some money, I can go to the National CUPE Union and say, let me talk to your members about how we can all work together to make our lives better. And all I want from you is their votes, not your money. I want them to come and join us in making the world a better place. That's what Dave Barrett did every day, not just for 3 years, but Carole and I have talked about this. His mentorship for us. I had the good fortune of working as a staffer in Ottawa, Adrian Dix as well, both of us together, and Dave would hold court. As British Columbians in Ottawa, which of course, as everyone knows, is very close to the center of the universe in Toronto, where Brad comes from, where 90 seconds is 6 minutes. But we got to go and listen to Dave tell war stories. As young, impressionable staffers, there was nothing better than that. And every time Dave gathered us together, he always had a smile on his face. He always had a story to tell, sometimes the same story over and over again. It got better because he got more animated, because he genuinely wanted us to leave knowing that we could go out and do anything. Anything was possible if we all stood together. And his support for Carole during those very, very difficult times, the Troubles, as an Irish descendant can say, was quite profound. And it affected not just Carole, but all of us. And those are things that Dave did that no one will ever hear about. Those are things that Dave did that were part of building community and keeping a movement alive that was so important to him and to the Barrett family. And it's just great to see you here tonight. And I'm going to stop now, Jeff, because Brad needs 6 minutes to wrap up.
Well, that was fun. So let's show some Dave Barrett love to our panel. Andrew Petter, Carole James, John Horgan, and all of you, thank you very much.
And our moderator, Jeff Meggs.
Thank you. You guys hold there. Yeah, hold there. Thank you to the panel. Thank you, each and every one. I remember when I first, we developed the concept of the lecture series and we started approaching. I just want to thank each and every member of the panel. First of all, that was an amazing conversation, but I really appreciate it. It's an incredible panel. This is just an amazing conversation today. So thank you to each and every one. When we asked and approached each one of these folks, they all said yes right away. They didn't take much convincing. And on behalf of the foundation, I really want to appreciate and thank each and every one of you. And I also want to thank the University of Victoria for agreeing to host this annual event. This is the first year, but we are going to be here many more years. And I also want to take the opportunity to invite folks who have come tonight. And I really want to appreciate everyone coming out, taking some time out of your busy schedules to come. We are a membership-driven foundation. We've got a special thing for folks. The first 45 people that join, and in the back, Josh Bijak, the executive director of the foundation, has membership forms. The first 45 people that join the foundation today will get an autographed poster of the inaugural Dave Barrett Lecture. Andrew, John, Carole, and Jeff have all signed the 45 copies as an incentive for you folks to, not that you would need one, not that you would need one. I also want to acknowledge the Barrett family who are here today, sitting in the front row. The first call was to the Barrett family to ensure that this would be something that would be okay by the family, and they said absolutely it would be. And I want to acknowledge the presence here. And I'm also very, very excited to, on behalf of the foundation, to announce that the foundation and the University of Victoria have signed a memorandum of agreement for a Dave Barrett scholarship, 2 scholarships per year at $5,000 that are in place for the next 5 years at least. And we will be able to add to that as we continue to receive more and more donations, not only for this event, but for the scholarships. So it is a very exciting announcement that we're making today on behalf of the foundation. I also want to thank our sponsors. The reception sponsor, we're going to have a reception just outside. If folks have a little bit more time, we can carry on the conversation in an informal setting, but there's open bar as well as some food. I want to thank the reception sponsors, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, Local 230. I also want to thank our event sponsors, the United Steelworkers, District 3, and the British Columbia Federation of Labour. Thank you to your generosity for this event. And finally, I really want to appreciate and thank our founding sponsor. When we first approached the Laborers International Union of North America, Local 1611, they didn't hesitate. And we said to them, we would like you to come in as the founding sponsor. We don't just want it to be a one-off. We'd like to lay deep and strong roots, a foundation, so that we don't have to keep coming back each and every year. And they came back and said, not only do we agree, we're coming in 10-year commitment to the Dave Barrett Lecture and the scholarships from Local 1611 of LaUna. So thank you. And of course, I asked each of the speakers to keep it tight, 90 seconds. They made fun because I needed 6.5 minutes. I needed 6.5 minutes. I thought we couldn't both take 6.5 minutes, John. Anyway, please join us in the reception. Thanks again to University of Victoria. Thanks to our amazing panel, moderators, and thank you all for coming on behalf of the foundation. Thank you so much.